Hello and welcome to ClockTower Game Studios. Today we're going to be going over part 4 of the Koban build. So far we've done the basic building itself, the ground floor, the second floor, including a detailed office interior, which you can see here. And next up we're going to be tackling actually putting the whole thing together and then doing a little bit of the build for the exterior detail. But first, there's another topic I want to tackle and talk about for a second. So the story goes that my girlfriend Callie is a member of a dice making group on Facebook and found a post from a gentleman named Jordan, who's a therapist that's helping a group of kids that he works with develop their social skills through Dungeons and Dragons, which I can definitely relate to as someone that came from a little bit of a rough background early on and used Dungeons and Dragons as a coping method to help learn my way through the world around me. I definitely think this is a good cause. So Jordan works for a company called Tanager Place in Iowa, and they're running 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, and I'm going to put some info in the description below. So if you have any extra miniatures or game tiles or anything like that, books, dice, anything, game materials that you want to donate, or if you want to donate financially, check out the description below and try and reach out to Jordan for that. We printed out some Lion Tower miniatures and Titan Forge miniatures models to send, and that's what you can see on the screen right now. We printed up those and got them shipped out here earlier this week. Just be sure that when you're reaching out, you contact Jordan and you're looking for the D&D for Social Skills program. Thank you guys for listening to me prattle on about that. And now we'll get back to crafting. So here you can see we've got the first floor of the building already finished. I've got what'll be the pavement there textured to match the concrete that makes up the sidewalks on the terrain boards. And the first thing we're going to do is take this piece of scrap that I had from earlier in the build, and I'm going to use it to make the roof floor. The floor of the roof, however you want to put it. Anyway, so instead of like drawing this out completely, I find the most square edge of the piece of scrap, and I just flipped over the second floor and placed it on top of it. And what I'm going to do is just trace out, so I only have to trace part of it, and instead of having to take measurements and then worry about how correct it is, just trace the original and go from there. Once we've got the part we need traced out, I'm just going to move the second floor out of the way and then make sure I label what this floor is going to be so I know which side actually goes onto the top edge. That way it matches up exactly. And what I mean is I want to make sure that the part that I'm writing on is going to be the part that's the side that's glued down to the top of the other building. After getting that cut out, I just double check my label and then test the fit against the top of the second floor so I can make sure that it's a good square clean fit and make sure there's not any areas that are going to end up needing a lot of touch up and repair. After doing a little dry fitting, I decided the next thing I wanted to do is glue the second floor down onto the first floor. And the reason for this is that'll help establish where any gaps are going to be so that I can use the cardstock that's going to be the banding around the second floor, the bottom of the second floor, to kind of hide any bad gaps. So I'll show more clearly what I mean by that here in a few minutes. But in the meantime, I'm just being careful, laying down a thin bead of PVA, just plain Elmer's glue all the way around it. And the reason I'm using PVA here instead of hot glue is it'll actually end up being a stronger bond. And I was doing this the last thing I was doing for a given night, so it had time to set up and dry before I was going to be messing with anything again. So here I'm just squaring up and putting on the second floor, and I'm just being careful to get it exactly placed how I want it. This is also another reason why I wanted to use PVA instead of hot glue, as it gives me a lot more working time to get the second floor positioned exactly correct. So here I just go around and I kind of clean up any mess. I make sure my corners are good and square, and once that's all done, as you can see, like I said, I just wipe away any bead of glue that's seeped out. But once that's done, I end up taking a couple books, and where I noticed that the base is warped there, I stack a mug on top of that and I stack a book on top of it so it'll have a bit of compression to hold it nice and level and as square to the first floor as I can. And remember, while you're doing stuff like this, be sure to use genre appropriate game books. Here you can see I'm using the Cyberpunk 2020 old school pen and paper RPG rule supplement. So while I was waiting on that to cure, another thing I spent some time doing was making some strips of cladding, just normal cardstock, that was the same thickness as my foam core. That way if I had any really messy spots or anything, or there were gaps like where the ladders coming up would be, I had some material pre-cut to fill in those gaps and hide the foam facing of the foam core, because of course we don't want that showing, and it'll also cause problems when it gets around to time to paint all this mess. So here I'm just using the foam core itself to get the measurement, and then I'm using a straight edge to help make the cut, and then I treat the cut just the same way I would as my foam core cuts. I multiple passes with a sharp X-Acto. Just take your time, get it nice and even. Be careful to hold both the cardstock and the straight edge in place, that way neither slips. And I just cut a bunch of these. And while I was doing that, I went ahead and cut my other 30mm pieces that I needed to do the top railing. So here I've got those all drawn out and cut up and labeled, and there you can see I've got the ladders that I printed in the background, and I've also got my 5mm the foam core thickness strips for the cladding. And here you can see that I can just use those to hide the foam, like I said, exactly what I intended to use them for. And I'm just going to go ahead and move on from here. The next thing I decided to do was test out some holes that had been punched through the cardstock. I just found a piece of cardstock that had the right height and punched holes in it using my hole punch there so I could hold it up and get a feel for whether or not it'd be correct or not, and how it would look compared to the inspiration model. Because as you can see, it has holes around that top railing. Granted, that wall is a full story tall, but it still had holes all the way through it. The last thing we have to do before we start gluing all the railing and the cladding into place is we need to cut in the windows and the door up here so they have allowance for the cardstock. So all I did there was I marked the edges of the door on the cardstock, and then I used my square and my hobby knife to just cut it off nice and evenly. That way it lines up nice and tight, and it'll have a snug fit on either side of the door. The only thing left to do after getting everything cut to size is to start putting it in place and gluing it together. So here I just do a test fit, make sure that I got it correct. I'm happy with how that fits together. So I'm going to go ahead and start gluing everything in. And just like all the other exterior features on the model so far, I'm going to just glue this into place using the same plain Elmer's PVA glue, the same white glue. Just spread it on there, get a nice even coat, make sure it's not too thick, not too thin. You want to have the entire glossy back coated, and you don't really want to have too much because then it'll ooze out and you have to end up going back through and touching it up like I do a little bit. You have to clean up your mess. Not a big deal, but it does get in the way a little bit. The only difference between doing the door and doing a window is not just do you need to mark the width of the window, you also need to mark the height, how far down into the cardstock you need to cut to get the gap cut out for the window. So here you can see I just take my cardstock, lay it right over the window and mark it out. And once I've got both sides marked on the width, I mark where I want it to sit as far as the height to cover up any joint at the bottom of the foam core. And then I mark the height of the window from there. And then once I've got that done, I go through with my straight edge and mark it straight across. And then I'll use that mark as my cut all the way across the window. That's the only difference between doing the windows and the doors, and I just go around after this and do all the windows and get that second floor completely carted in, get that bit of cladding on there. So while off camera, I went ahead and finished up the cladding all the way around the second floor, including the rail around the balcony that sits over the driveway. I've got that all flush cut and joined together at the roof there. And this part, I'm just going to go through and do the same thing that I did for the cladding for the second floor, I'm going to do for the roof. I'm going to just take my cardstock, smear some PVA on it, and then carefully place it to where it covers up not just the raw foam core edge, but I also hide some of my mistakes that I made in the previous step, where I cut the roof inconsistently, like the wall's not quite right, they don't quite match up. The worst spot that I noticed there was an issue was on the far left wall where the big picture window is there by my thumb. The paint on that interior wall caused a bulge where it warped. So you can kind of see that there in the cardstock, but it's not very noticeable. But I'm just going to go through, and the same way that I did on the cladding on the second floor, I'm going to just kind of use this time to hide those sins a little bit. And while I'm doing that, add the railing. So that's what I'm doing here. And then as I was coming around to finish the last side, I realized I needed to cut in the gap for the ladder. And so I ended up taking a measurement, used my ladder, figured out where exactly I wanted it, made a mark, and then just made the gap fit the same width as the ladder gap in the back did. After getting that cut in, I decided to take a break, take a look at the model that I had put together so far. As you can see, I've attached all the cladding, all the railing. I had set up a mock-up of some of the options I had available to decorate the exterior of the building. So the next thing I decided to do was I definitely wanted to add one of these picnic tables on the second floor there, and I figure we can go over how to build those real quick. It's not very difficult, just takes a little time and little effort. So we're going to start with coffee stirrers. I use coffee stirrers instead of popsicle sticks because they're a little more narrow and they're not quite as thick. So for me, for like 1x6s or something that would be used for making a picnic table or a bench, they fit more in scale to me. So anyway, the first thing I'm doing is I'm using my grid on my mat to cut off one of the round ends and get it square. And then I'm just going to cut these down to 1.5 inch length. That way I've got the appropriate length for the tabletop that I want. I know that's the length I want from previous builds, so I just use my cutting mat, the grid on it, square it up and go from there. And I'm going to repeat that 3 times because I know that I want the width of my coffee table to match the width of 3 of these side-by-side planks. Once I've got those cut down to size, I use toothpick or cocktail sticks to make the bracing, kind of the frame for the whole thing. So I get this cut down to the length I want, and then I'm just going to use super glue on the underside of the table because it won't be visible, it won't make a difference. So I just use super glue. I run a bead of it across all 3 planks, as you can see here. And once I get that in place, I place the cut down spar that I've made, the stick there, and I just stick it into place and then kind of make sure that it's as parallel to the ends of the planks as I can get it. This doesn't have to be perfect. A lot of it's going to be hidden by not just the table itself, but by the terrain around it. Remember, this is going to have the lip of the railing all the way around it, so any kind of mistakes on the underside of the table really not going to be visible. And then I just repeat the same thing for the second support there. After getting the tabletop put together, I move on to getting the benches put together. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to cut down 2 lengths to match my tabletop length, just like a normal picnic table. I want them, like I said, still around 1.5 inches. Once I've got those cut down to size, I use cocktail stick or toothpick, as it's called, to make the supports, the cross beams for these. And I just glue those in the same position or as close as I can get it to the supports that are on the bottom side of the tabletop. And once I get everything glued into place here, the next thing I do is trim down the kind of the stray edges of the tabletop to get them all roughly the same length. And then once that's done, I'll start gluing in the legs. So working on the legs next, I'm going to take my toothpick and cut the ends off of it so it's not the sharp pokey end. I just want to, as clean as I can get, to a nice square cut. It's a little difficult just doing it with an X-Acto on a cutting mat, but It doesn't have to be perfect. Again, this is going to be hidden underneath a railing at the bottom of a table, so it's not going to need to be perfect. So what I'm doing here is I'm using my model as a reference for where I want the tabletop to be, and I'm marking how long that means the legs need to be. Once I've got that figured out, the next thing I do is go through and cut 4 matching legs and get those glued into place. Getting them glued into place square with the table is a little difficult. They're very fiddly, but just take your time, use whatever references you need to, and just try and keep them as square as possible. And I glue those to the inside of the insides of the frame on the tabletop. That way I can slide the braces on the legs down over those in a minute. So I'll show that here in just a second. So before the glue has completely set on the legs, while it's still got a little play left in them, I'm just making some last minute adjustments to the angle on those, and then I'm going to work the bench frame down over those, as you see here, once I get it squared up and facing the right direction. So my legs aren't quite perfect, so I end up having to squeeze them in towards each other a little bit and put a weird angle on them, but not as bad as it could be. And then I just kind of fiddle with it and slide these down into place until I'm happy with it. And once I get them figured out where I want them to be, I go ahead and glue them down. Like I said, remember, do this step while your super glue that's attaching the legs to the tabletop is still a little wet. Otherwise, it won't have the give you need it to. It won't have the play, so you can actually get the legs into place. Once I'm happy with the placement, I just use a toothpick, the discarded end of one, to smear the super glue around a little bit, make sure that it's on every side of the legs, and make sure that it's bonded to both the bench and the support. And once that's there, I just leave it to dry, and it takes a little bit to set up, but I'm finished. Which brings us to the last bit of actual exterior construction on the building itself, which is punching the holes in the rail. As you can see, I just used a hole punch and went around the cardstock, careful to not tear it off of the walls, and just randomly punched holes in the railing. This, like I said earlier, produced the same sort of circular hole punch out effect that the original Inspiration building had, and it also, I think, adds an interesting gameplay dynamic where, while it will be easy to take cover behind the rails, it won't be possible to just outright hide behind them. And that pretty much wraps up construction on the entire building. We've got all 3 floors built, we got the interior of the 2nd floor done and decorated, and we've got the exterior of the entire building completely built. All that's left to do is put a little bit of life on it and put some paint on it, put a bow on it, and call it done, which will be the next video. We'll be doing the exterior painting and adding the touches of life to it to make it look as alive as the interior does. So if you've enjoyed this video, or if you've enjoyed the entire series so far, if you've been keeping up with it, thank you very much for watching. And if you want to catch the last video in the series, like I said, the painting video, be sure to give us a like, subscribe, hit the notification bell to make sure you get notified whenever that video goes up. And thank you again very much for watching. I'd also like to give a couple more shout outs. Titan Forge Miniatures, their models were included in the build, the office furniture, the car, and then a different shout out to Lion Towers Miniatures for their models that we've donated. They weren't aware that we did that. It was there was no money that exchanged hands or anything. It was purely a donation. I just want to give a shout out to them for having excellent models that are great for D&D, and we were very happy to have access to those so we could print them off and ship them out to make the donation to the guys over at Tanager Place and Jordan and the D&D for Social Skills Development program. And be sure to remember to check out the links in the description so you can check out the process for donating to those guys. That'd be a really cool thing to get them some more miniatures and some other materials shipped to them. So let's work on getting that done. Also, be sure to follow us on social media such as Facebook for major announcements. Instagram gets daily updates of what we've been up to, and on Twitter I live tweet some of the things that we're up to, such as making videos, building terrain and that sort of stuff, and gameplay whenever we're getting around to doing some playtesting. So be sure to check those out. Also, if you want to support us, you can buy us coffee on Buy Me a Coffee. You can support us on Patreon. We have different tiers for that. I haven't got the game type for the month sorted out yet, but I'm working on that. That'll be up probably at the beginning to middle of this week. And also, you can shop on the Amazon links in the description below, which are affiliate links. You get the materials and the tools you wanted at cost from normal Amazon links, and we get a little bit of a kickback off that. So it's a great way to support the channel at no additional cost to yourselves. And remember, at the Clock Tower, it's always game time.